The square of Red Bluff was not a place where innocence lingered. Dust clung to every surface, floating in the heat as though even the air refused to rest. The wooden platform in the center stood like a cruel stage, and upon it 2 sisters were bound by coarse ropes, the skin at their wrists raw from days of captivity. The crowd pressed closer, boots thudding against the packed earth, voices rolling like a wave that carried both hunger and indifference. Their laughter did not match the weight of what was about to unfold. It was not just an auction. It was the unraveling of 2 young lives beneath the unforgiving gaze of strangers. Nia stood tall despite the ropes, her chin lifted as though dignity could be a weapon sharp enough to pierce through the sneers and jeers of the men below. The wind tugged strands of her black hair across her face, but she did not shake them away. Beside her, Leia trembled. She was younger, smaller, her lips bitten until they bled, as if pain could hold back the sob that threatened to betray her fear. She leaned into her sister, pressing shoulder to shoulder as though closeness might hide her from the merciless world staring up at her. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp and mocking, promising the crowd something rare, something to be claimed. He laughed as if the sisters' existence were a joke, a commodity. Coins clinked, bids rose, and with every number shouted, the fragile thread of hope inside Leia seemed to fray further. Yet Nia's eyes, dark and unflinching, refused to lower. She had decided that if despair was inevitable, she would meet it without surrender. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her silence was a shield, her stillness a rebellion. Then a figure stepped forward from the crowd, a ranch hand, broad-shouldered, his breath sour with whiskey, swaggered to the front. His voice slurred, loud, claiming them as though the decision were already his. The crowd cheered. Some laughed, others jeered, their amusement echoing like thunder rolling across a canyon. Leia's body shook violently, and her fingers dug into the rope binding her wrists, desperate for any release. Nia's stomach turned to stone, but she refused to show fear. Inside, though, despair clawed at her. The rope, the stage, the smirks, everything screamed of a future stolen. But then the air shifted. The sound of boots striking the ground broke through the clamor. From the far side of the street, a man crossed slowly, steadily, each step carrying the weight of quiet authority. His coat was worn, but kept with dignity, the badge at his chest catching a shard of sunlight. His hat shaded his eyes, but the strength in his presence silenced the square before he even reached the platform. Sheriff Luke Callahan did not need to shout. He was a wall of calm amid chaos, and the crowd parted without thought as he approached. Nia's eyes locked on him. She could not yet decide whether he was salvation or another threat. But in that moment, the rope bit less cruelly into her wrists, as though the universe had paused to allow something unexpected. Luke's voice cut through the tension, steady, commanding, leaving no room for challenge. A pouch of coins fell heavy onto the platform, final and undeniable. The auctioneer stammered, faltered, and the ranch hand's face flushed with rage. Yet the crowd knew instinctively where the power now lay. The sheriff's hand brushed near his revolver, not drawn, only a promise, and the murmurs died to silence. The rope fell away, sliced clean by Luke's knife. For the first time in days, blood rushed back into Nia's arms, bringing with it the sting of freedom. She rubbed the raw marks, her breath trembling though her face remained unbroken. Leia pressed closer, her tears threatening to spill now that escape no longer seemed a fantasy. The sheriff did not ask for thanks. He only said, "Come on," his voice quiet, almost gentle. The crowd parted once again as he led them down from the platform, away from the hands that had tried to claim them, toward a door that might mean safety or another cage. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was cooler, shaded, and scented faintly of smoke from the stove. The walls were plain, the desk worn, but after the heat and humiliation of the square, it felt almost like sanctuary. Luke poured water into tin cups and handed them over without ceremony. Leia drank greedily, coughing between gulps, while Nia sipped slow, watching him over the rim, still trying to read his silence. He asked for nothing. He demanded nothing. He simply stood by, arms crossed, waiting until their breath steadied. The sisters lay awake that night in a room that hummed with tension, yet promised more safety than they had known in months. Leia curled beneath the blanket, clutching it as though it were a lifeline. Nia remained upright, her back against the wall, her eyes flicking often to Luke, who sat in a chair between them and the door. His revolver rested across his thigh, his body still, patient, unwavering. She wanted to ask why. Why would a man risk his money, his standing, maybe even his life, for two women the town had already judged worthless? But when her lips parted, no words came. Her voice had carried her strength on that stage, but here it faltered. Luke did not look at her, but his presence spoke louder than any words could. He was not there to watch them like property. He was there to guard, to bear the weight of a threat they could not yet name. Outside, the town shifted restlessly, whispers curling like smoke through every saloon and porch. But inside, within four walls, and the steady rhythm of a man who did not abandon his post, Nia allowed herself, for the first time since capture, to unclench her fists. She lay down beside her sister, her chest heavy but her breath steady, and closed her eyes to the fragile possibility that tomorrow might be different. Morning crept soft through the curtains, gold spilling across the desk and the worn floorboards. Nia stirred, blinking against the light, her body tense as she remembered where she was. Yet when her gaze landed on Luke, still in his chair, eyes shadowed from a night without sleep, the fear eased, just slightly. Leia rose slowly, clutching the cup in her hands, her face less pinched than the night before. For the first time, the sisters woke not to chains or jeers, but to bread and water set quietly before them. Yet Red Bluff was a town of restless tongues. By midday, voices rose louder than usual, boots striking harder against the boardwalk. The knock at the sheriff's door came sharp, insistent. Nia's body stiffened, her breath quickening, as two townsmen demanded to know the sheriff's intentions. Luke blocked their view, his frame filling the doorway, his voice calm yet firm. "That's over." His words were final, his stance unshakable, and though the men left muttering, their eyes carried the warning of battles yet to come. Nia's gaze followed Luke as he locked the door again, her suspicion mingling with something new, something fragile, like the first warmth after a long winter. She wanted to ask again why he did it, why he risked everything for them. And when she finally did, his answer was simple: "Because I could." It was not a confession, it was not a vow, but the weight in his tone made her believe it was more than he admitted. Outside, the town buzzed with whispers, Inside, the sisters slowly tasted what it meant to breathe without fear, to drink without begging, to sit without chains. Nia found herself studying Luke when she thought he wasn't watching, the scar at his jaw, the way he shifted his chair to always face the door, the heaviness in his eyes that spoke of battles unseen. She could not name what stirred in her chest, but it was something warmer than survival, something steadier than despair. The night stretched long again, but the silence between them was no longer sharp with suspicion. It softened, filled with the quiet crackle of the stove, the even breaths of Leia asleep, and the low scrape of Luke's chair as he shifted but never left his post. Nia's thoughts wandered to the stage, to the man with whiskey breath, to the crowd that had laughed at her pain. And then her eyes drifted to Luke, to the way he had stood without flinching, a shield against a world determined to strip her bare. The contrast was a balm she had not expected. Healing came not in grand gestures, but in the stillness of being seen, guarded, respected. When dawn came again, it brought with it a new rhythm. Bread was shared, water poured, silence held not as distance, but as comfort. Nia began to feel something she had nearly forgotten: choice. For though the town might rage and gossip, though danger pressed at the edges, inside this room she was not on a platform. She was not a prize to be bought. She was a woman who had survived, and beside her stood a man who, for reasons still veiled, had chosen to fight. And as the morning light poured across the sheriff's office, Nia knew this was only the beginning. The town would not forgive easily. Trouble would come again, harder, sharper, wearing the faces of law and cruelty alike. But for now, she let herself taste the fragile sweetness of freedom. And in that sweetness something warmer bloomed, a thread of trust, a seed of hope, the whisper of love yet to come. And if you, dear listener, find your heart stirred by the courage of a woman who refused to bow and a man who stood when silence was easier, let that feeling settle gently within you. Let it remind you that even in the harshest deserts of life, healing can bloom where kindness dares to root. If this story speaks to your soul, if it brings you light in dark hours, I invite you to share your thoughts, to leave a comment, to let your voice join ours. And if you wish to walk further into this journey, into love that defies fear and hope that survives despair, then like and subscribe so that together we can keep breathing life into stories that heal. The day outside Red Bluff grew louder, boots and voices rising like a storm waiting to break. Inside, however, the sisters lingered in the quiet, drawing strength from bread, warmth, and the steady presence of the sheriff. The fragile peace was only a pause, a fragile bridge before the next wave. But sometimes a single pause can carry the weight of a lifetime. And as Nia lifted her gaze to the man who had cut her free, the man who stood between her and the world, she felt the story of her life shift, turning its first page into something new, something she had never dared believe could be hers. That was the morning she began to understand that safety was not the absence of danger. It was the presence of someone willing to fight for you. And with that understanding, her heart stepped quietly, hesitantly, toward the future. The second morning in Red Bluff arrived with a hush, as if the town itself braced for the storm of whispers that followed the sheriff's defiance. Nia stirred first, her body weary, but her spirit sharpened by the memory of ropes biting her wrists and the quiet strength of the man who had cut them free. Beside her, Leia breathed evenly, curled against the blanket, her face softer than it had been in weeks. For the first time since their capture, her sister's sleep carried no whimper of fear. That small peace was enough to steady Nia's heart, though she would never admit aloud how deeply it mattered. Luke moved quietly by the stove, the low glow of morning fire casting light against the sharp lines of his face. He poured water into a pot, his hands deliberate, practiced. He did not ask if they were hungry. He simply placed bread on the table, a gesture so ordinary yet so healing it caught Nia off guard. She had grown used to men who demanded, who took, who reminded her of her powerlessness with every glance. This man moved with a different rhythm. His silence did not wound. It gave her space to breathe. She sat upright, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers, and joined him at the table. Leia remained on the cot, blinking sleep from her eyes, drawn by the smell of bread. The warmth of the stove seeped into their skin, easing the tightness that had lived in their chests for too long. Every bite of bread was an act of survival, but also something gentler, a reminder that life, though scarred, still offered small kindnesses. Healing was never loud. It was the soft gift of food, the hush of safety, the quiet presence of someone who refused to turn away. Nia lifted her gaze across the table. Luke leaned back in his chair, cup in hand, eyes fixed on the window as though he could already hear the town stirring. His jaw was set, his shoulders rigid beneath the weight of unspoken battles. She wanted to ask what came next, what dangers brewed beyond the locked door. Yet she remained silent, studying him instead, trying to measure the man who had stepped onto a platform not for power or pride, but for them. The knock at the door shattered the calm, hard, deliberate. Leia flinched, nearly spilling her cup. Nia's body went taut, her fingers brushing instinctively against the edge of the rifle leaning near the wall. Luke rose, his chair scraping against the floor, and crossed to the door with the steady gait of a man who feared nothing but knew everything about danger. When he opened it, two men stood outside, the storekeeper and his boy, their eyes restless, their mouths sharp with questions. "Heard you bought them off the block," the older man said, his tone heavy with judgment. "What do you plan to do with them, Sheriff?" Luke filled the doorway, his presence a barrier that left not even a sliver for them to peer inside. "That's over," he replied flatly. "You've no concern here." His words fell with a weight that silenced further questions. Muttering under their breath, the men retreated, their boots thudding against the boardwalk. Luke shut the door with a firmness that left no doubt. He would not yield. Nia's chest loosened, just slightly. She studied him as he returned to the desk, his expression calm but his shoulders carrying the truth. This was only the beginning. Trouble would come again, and harder. Still, his defiance planted something inside her, a fragile seed of trust. Not yet love, not yet safety, but a promise that perhaps the world still held men who stood when others stayed silent. Leia whispered, "Will they come back?" Her voice trembled with the echo of fear. Luke's eyes softened as he answered, "Probably, but they won't take you." He said it without hesitation, without flourish, like it was as simple as breathing. And somehow that made it believable. The day unfolded slowly, heavy with the weight of waiting. Luke left briefly to make his rounds, his boots echoing down the street as he disappeared beyond sight. Before he went, he handed Nia a rifle, his eyes steady. "If anyone tries that door, chamber around and aim waist high. His tone was not condescending. It was trust, plain and unadorned. Nia's fingers curled around the weapon with familiarity, surprising him only slightly. She had held rifles before, though never with her life balanced so precariously on the trigger. While he was gone, she paced the office, her steps restless, her gaze shifting constantly to the window. Leia lingered near the cot, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Fear lingered, but there was also a sliver of something else. Hope, fragile and new, a light breaking through the cracks of shadow. Luke returned near midday, dust clinging to his coat, sweat at the brim of his hat. He carried a parcel under his arm, 2 plain dresses of calico fabric, folded neat. "For you and her," he said simply, nodding toward Leia. The dresses were nothing fancy, just modest cloth stitched together, but to Nia they felt like the first gift of dignity in months. She traced the fabric with her fingers, her throat tightening. The words she spoke were clipped but honest. "Thank you." He did not linger on her gratitude. He only stoked the stove, set water to heat, and carried on with the quiet resolve of a man who gave without asking. And that, more than anything, unsettled Nia. Kindness she understood when it came with expectation. But this left her defenses trembling, unsure where to place her walls. By evening, the peace shattered once more. A pounding at the door, a slurred voice she recognized with a chill, the drunken ranch hand from the square. His words dripped venom as he accused Luke of stealing what was rightfully his. The street outside fell into silence, men leaning against porch posts, eager to see the sheriff tested. Luke stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. "Go home," he said, voice low, steady. The drunk sneered, bottle dangling in his hand. "Or what? You'll shoot me over them?" The threat hung heavy, but Luke's eyes did not waver. "Leave," he said, closer now, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had drawn lines no one dared cross. The drunk faltered, muttered curses, and stumbled back toward the saloon. Luke remained still until the man's figure disappeared into the shadows. Through the window, Nia watched him, her heart pounding, her grip tight on the rifle she had nearly raised. When he came back inside, she set it down slowly, her breath unsteady. "You almost used it," he said quietly. "If he came through the door, yes," she answered, her voice firm. "Good," he replied. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, silence burned hotter than words. A fragile understanding settled between them, a recognition that their survival was no longer a matter of chance, but of shared defiance. Night came, the stove glowing with warmth that soothed weary bones. Leia curled beneath the blanket quickly, sleep pulling her into dreams that no longer trembled with terror. Nia sat longer, watching Luke as he settled once more into his chair, revolver resting near. His presence was both comfort and enigma. She studied him openly now, the scar at his jawline, the heaviness etched into the corners of his mouth, the way his eyes flicked to every shadow beyond the door. He had risked his coin, his name, his position, all for them. The town would call it folly, maybe betrayal. Yet here he was, silent, steadfast, guarding them as though they mattered more than the weight of Red Bluff's judgment. The thought pierced her chest, not with fear, but with something warmer, something she could barely allow herself to name. She lay beside her sister, the rifle within reach, her gaze drifting often to the man in the chair. She could not bring herself to trust fully, not yet. But she knew this. If the world came breaking through that door tonight, Luke Callahan would rise first to meet it. And for now, that was enough. The fire crackled softly, a lullaby of warmth. Healing came in fragments, in the steady guard of a man's silence, in the fragile peace of a sister's breath evening out, in the knowledge that tomorrow might hold something other than despair. And as Nia closed her eyes, her final thought before sleep was not of ropes or fear, but of a quiet strength sitting just beyond the lamplight, keeping watch. And so the night passed, the town restless beyond the walls. But inside the sheriff's office, a fragile bond began to take root, delicate yet unyielding, carrying them toward a future neither had dared to imagine. Dawn broke in Red Bluff with a pale light, the kind that spilled over the rooftops like a hesitant promise. Nia awoke to its glow, slipping across the sheriff's office floor, gilding the worn boards in a fragile warmth. The fire in the stove had burned low, its embers still glowing faintly, and the air held a quiet that pressed gently against her senses. For the first time in what felt like forever, she woke not to fear or harsh commands, but to the steady rhythm of a man moving quietly at the stove. Luke was already there, sleeves rolled, his broad frame bent over the kettle as he poured water into cups. She sat up slowly, brushing her tangled hair from her face, her body tense until she saw Leia still curled under the blanket, breathing in soft, even waves. The sight was enough to soften the tightness in her chest. Leia's face, once drawn tight by fear, had loosened in sleep, as if the shadows had retreated just a little. Nia's fingers lingered at her sister's temple for a moment, tucking loose strands of hair back, a gesture that had carried them through storms and raids, hunger and hiding. It was the only healing she knew. This simple touch that said, "You are not alone." Luke placed a cup on the table. "Coffee," he said quietly, his voice low, roughened by sleep and silence. Nia rose barefoot, the floor cool against her skin, and joined him. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup, letting the rising steam brush her face. The warmth slid into her chest, calming the storm that always lingered there. She did not thank him. She still wasn't ready for that, but her eyes lingered on his for longer than before. The morning stretched uneasily. Outside, the sounds of the town grew louder, men's voices carrying sharper than usual, boots hitting the boardwalk with weight. Luke leaned against the desk, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the window as though he could already feel the tension building. Nia followed his eyes and saw only sunlight and shadows, but the set of his jaw told her the day would not pass quietly. By noon, the first challenge arrived. Hooves clattered against the dirt street, drawing closer. Luke straightened, his shoulders tightening as a group of men dismounted in front of the office. Through the window, Nia saw them. The judge, his fine coat marking him apart from the ranch hands at his back, and a paper clenched in his hand like a weapon. Leia stirred on the cot, fear flooding her eyes the moment she recognized the man who had stood smugly near the platform days before. Nia's breath grew sharp, her hands instinctively reaching for the rifle. Luke stepped outside before the men could knock. His voice carried calm authority, firm but never raised. The judge read the order, claiming the sisters for the territorial court, calling them property, intruders, burdens. Luke did not even glance at the paper. His reply was quiet, final. No. The judge blinked, disbelieving. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Luke said, steady as stone. "They're not going back on that platform, not while I wear this badge." The ranch hands shifted, fingers brushing gun belts, but Luke did not move. His presence filled the street, his calm more dangerous than fury. He stepped closer, toe to toe with the judge, his voice a low growl meant for all to hear. "You want to argue law? We ride to the county seat and do it proper. But you try to drag them out of here, you'll go through me first." Silence fell heavy. The crowd that had begun to gather held its breath. The judge's face reddened, but after a moment he shoved the paper back into his coat. "You're making a mistake, Callahan. This isn't over." Luke's answer was cool, unshaken. "Maybe. But it's over for tonight." When the men rode away, the street exhaled. Luke re-entered the office, shutting the door behind him with a weight that echoed in the sisters' bones. Nia stood near the stove, rifle clutched in her hands, her chest still pounding. She had heard every word, seen every step, and the enormity of what he had done crashed over her. He had stood between her and the men who would have dragged her back to that cruel stage. Not for coin this time, not for law written on paper, but simply because he refused to let it happen. "They were going to take us," she whispered. "They were going to try," Luke corrected, his voice even, his gaze steady as it met hers. He crossed the room and placed his hand gently over the rifle, easing it from her grip. His touch was firm but careful, as though he knew her instinct was to hold on or be swept away. He set the weapon aside, then looked at her with something unflinching. But they didn't. The strength of his certainty unravelled something inside her chest. For so long she had lived braced for betrayal, for cruelty, for the next blow. Yet here was a man who had risked everything, his post, his life, his place in the town, to keep her safe. Her breath came uneven, her voice caught between suspicion and wonder. Why? Luke's answer was stripped bare, no embellishment. "Because you don't deserve what they would have done to you." The words hit her harder than chains ever had. She had spent months carrying the lie that she was less than human in the eyes of the men around her, that she was to be traded, punished, forgotten. But Luke's voice, quiet and fierce, shattered that lie. For a heartbeat, she felt seen, not as a captive, not as a prize, but as a woman. Without realizing she moved, she stepped closer, her body drawn to him by the weight of everything unspoken. He did not retreat. His hand rose slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The touch lingered just long enough for her to feel its warmth settle deep inside her. Her heart thundered, her breath caught, and then his lips found hers. It was not gentle. It was not rehearsed. It was the kind of kiss born of desperation, of survival, of the fire that sparks when two souls collide at the edge of ruin. His mouth was warm, rough with truth, and her fingers clutched the front of his coat as though he were the only anchor left in a world spinning out of control. He pulled her close, one hand steady at her back, holding her as if he had been waiting for this since the moment he first saw her bound on that stage. When he drew back, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the hush. Silence filled the room, thick with everything words could not carry. Leia, wide-eyed, had retreated to the cot, wrapping herself in the blanket. But even she seemed to understand that something had shifted. For the first time, she looked at her sister not just with fear, but with relief. Luke stepped back first, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with the weight of choices already made. "We'll have to be ready," he said quietly. "They'll come again. Harder next time." Naya's voice, though unsteady, carried a new strength. "Then we stay ready." The words surprised her, but they rang true. For so long she had been surviving, running, hiding, clenching her teeth against despair. But now, with this man's handprint still warm on her back and his taste lingering at her lips, she felt something steadier than survival. She felt the stirrings of choice, of fight, of love, not born of fragility, but of fire. That night, the air inside the sheriff's office was different. The stove glowed as always, the cot creaked beneath the weight of two sisters, and Luke sat in his chair by the door, revolver within reach. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Nia lay awake longer than before, her gaze fixed on the man who had stood against a town, who had kissed her like she was worth more than every coin and every law written in Red Bluff. She traced her lips with her fingers, half in disbelief, half in remembrance, and allowed herself, for the first time since her brother's death, to believe that tomorrow might belong to her. When the lamp burned low and shadows lengthened across the walls, she closed her eyes. The weight of fear still pressed from outside, but inside she was wrapped in the quiet healing of safety, of trust beginning to take root, of a love too new to name but too strong to deny. And as sleep claimed her, the world beyond the locked door faded, leaving only the warmth of firelight and the unshakable presence of the man who refused to let her fall. The days that followed unfurled like threads pulled taut, each carrying both tension and fragile beauty. Red Bluff was restless. Gossip curled from porch to porch, whispers turning sharp as blades, yet inside the sheriff's office, time slowed into something softer. The stove's glow carried warmth through the cool evenings, and though danger pressed at the door, healing made its quiet way into the small room. Leia began to smile again, fleeting at first, quick and cautious, like a bird testing its wings. She laughed once when Luke set a loaf of bread clumsily on the table and nearly dropped the knife that followed. The sound startled Nia, so rare, so bright, but it slipped into her chest like sunlight through cracks. She had nearly forgotten what her sister's laughter sounded like. That small gift was enough to soften her vigilance for a moment. Healing often arrived not in sweeping gestures, but in fragments, a smile, a loaf of bread, a fire's hum against silence. Nia herself shifted slowly, layer by layer. She still kept her back close to walls, her eyes sharp on every shadow. But when Luke set folded calico dresses before her and Leia, she touched the fabric with reverence. She smoothed it with her thumbs as if to memorize the threads. It was not the dress itself, but what it meant, that someone believed they deserved to be clothed in dignity rather than shame. For Nia, who had been stripped of both name and worth, the gesture left her throat tight with unshed words. Luke asked for nothing in return. He never pressed, never demanded gratitude. He moved through his days with quiet purpose, filing papers, patrolling the streets, stoking the stove at dusk. He spoke little, but his silence was not cruel. It was space, a shelter where the sisters could begin to breathe again. And when he did speak, his words carried weight. "You're safe here. They won't take you." Simple phrases, yet they settled in Nia's chest like stones that anchored rather than crushed. But the town did not sleep easily. On the third evening, a drunk voice rose once more outside, fists pounding against the sheriff's door. Leia scrambled toward the corner, her eyes wide with fear. Nia gripped the rifle, every muscle burning with the memory of chains. Luke opened the door, stepping into the street with a calm that made the onlookers hush. His presence alone was enough to make the drunk stumble back. "Go home," he said, voice steady, unyielding. And the man, despite his curses, obeyed. Through the window, Nia watched every movement. Her heart hammered, but when Luke returned, shutting the door firmly, her grip on the rifle loosened. Their eyes met in the lamplight, something silent passing between them, acknowledgement, trust, the weight of shared defiance. It was no longer chance that bound them, it was choice. That night, after Leia had fallen asleep, Nia sat awake longer than usual. Luke was in his chair, revolver within reach, his gaze fixed on the door. She studied him openly now, letting her eyes trace the lines of wear across his face, the scar that marked his jaw, the heaviness tucked into the corners of his mouth. He did not watch her in return, but the air between them hummed with an awareness that neither could ignore. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but carrying weight. "Why do you keep doing this?" His eyes flicked to hers, steady, unwavering. "Because I can't stand by and watch it happen again." "Not to you." The answer struck deeper than she expected, pulling at places inside her she had long walled off. She had been seen as less than human, treated as property. Yet this man's words reminded her that she was still a person worth protecting. It was not charity, it was conviction, and it broke something open inside her chest. She rose slowly, her bare feet whispering against the wood floor, and crossed the space between them. For a heartbeat she hesitated, searching his face for any shadow of cruelty, any trace of possession. She found none. Only resolve, only quiet strength. So when his hand rose, brushing a strand of her hair back from her face, she did not retreat. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her heart hammering, as though it had just remembered what it meant to be alive. The kiss that followed was different from the first. It was slower, deeper, a promise rather than desperation. His lips pressed against hers with steady warmth, anchoring her in a world that had tried to tear her adrift. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his coat, grounding herself in him, in this moment, in the fragile hope that perhaps life still held beauty. He held her firmly, not to claim, but to steady, as though reminding her she was safe now, here in his arms. When they parted, their breaths mingled, their foreheads pressed together. Neither spoke. Words felt too small for the enormity of what had shifted between them. Across the room, Leia stirred faintly in her sleep, unaware of the vow that had been born in silence. Luke drew back first, his jaw tightening, his eyes shadowed but sure. "We'll have to be ready," he murmured. "They won't stop." "Then we stay ready," Nia replied, her voice stronger now, steadier, a flame rather than a whisper. From that night onward, something in the office changed. The cot no longer felt like a place of hiding, but of rest. The desk with its papers and rifles became less a symbol of law and more a shield that stood between them and the cruelty outside. And the stove's glow was no longer just warmth. It was the heart of something forming quietly, stubbornly, against the odds. The next morning brought another test, A group of townsmen gathered outside, muttering, restless. The judge returned with his papers, waving them like banners of authority. But Luke stood unmoving on the porch, his shoulders squared, his voice steady. "Not while I wear this badge," he told them again. And though the men scowled, though threats lingered in their eyes, they rode away. Inside, Nia gripped the edge of the desk, her body shaking not with fear, but with the realization that she was no longer alone in this fight. She had someone who stood beside her, someone who chose her safety over the town's approval. That knowledge planted roots deeper than chains had ever reached. That evening, as the stove's glow wrapped them in warmth, Nia sat at the table Luke had built with his own hands. She ran her fingers across the smooth wood, tracing the grain, anchoring herself in the reality that life could still offer gifts, shaped not from cruelty, but from care. Leia braided her hair by the fire, humming softly, her voice timid but bright. The sound filled the room with a gentle healing, a melody that wrapped around them like a promise. Luke watched from his chair, his gaze steady, his silence speaking more than words. Their eyes met across the lamplight, and neither looked away. In that moment, the danger outside, the gossip, the threats, all faded. What remained was the fragile certainty that they were building something together, brick by brick, breath by breath. Not just survival, but a beginning. When night finally deepened, Nia lay on the cot beside her sister, her gaze drifting often to Luke in his chair. His revolver rested within reach, his hat tilted low, his body angled toward the door. He was weary, yet unyielding, his presence a wall between them and the world. She closed her eyes, her heart steady, and allowed herself to believe that the future, however uncertain, could hold more than fear. It could hold love, strength, and healing. And, as sleep claimed her, the last thing she felt was not the memory of ropes, but the warmth of trust taking root in her chest, carrying her into the next day where the fight would grow fiercer, but so too would the bond that now bound her to the man who refused to let her fall. The morning of the town meeting arrived with a sky the color of steel, heavy clouds rolling low, as if the heavens themselves leaned close to watch what would unfold. Luke had been awake long before dawn, his chair angled toward the door, the revolver resting across his thigh. He had not slept more than a few minutes at a time, but there was no weariness in him now, only resolve. When the first shafts of grey light slipped across the floorboards, he rose, pulled on his coat, and buckled his gun belt with deliberate steadiness. Nia watched him from the cot where she had sat braiding Leia's hair. Her hands were calm, but her eyes never left him. She had seen men prepare for battle before, had seen the weight of death in their faces, but Luke carried something different. It was not anger that fueled him, nor pride. It was duty, carved deep into his bones. When he glanced at her, their eyes locked in silent understanding. This day would change everything. Leia fidgeted on the cot, her small hands twisting in her lap. "What will happen?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nia touched her sister's cheek, smoothing the worry with a gentleness born of countless storms weathered together. "We will stand," she answered softly. "We will not hide." Healing came in that simple promise, spoken with strength she had not known she still carried. Luke adjusted his hat, his voice low but steady. "It starts soon." Nia rose, her chin lifting. "We come too." His brow furrowed, the protector in him hesitating, but when her dark eyes refused to yield, he gave a single nod. "Stay behind me," he said. "Let them see you, but don't rise to their bait." The three of them walked together down the main street of Red Bluff. The townsfolk turned as they passed, some whispering, some glaring, some shifting uneasily as if unsure whether to condemn or admire the sight. Nia felt their eyes like heat on her skin, but she kept her head high, each step a defiance of the shame they had tried to place upon her. Leia walked close, her bare feet brushing the wooden boards of the walk, clutching the edge of her sister's dress. But her chin, too, was lifted. The saloon had been cleared for the council, chairs and benches set in a wide circle. The mayor sat at one end, the judge beside him, ranchers and merchants filling the rest. The air was thick with smoke and suspicion. When Luke entered with the sisters behind him, silence rippled through the room. He removed his hat, set it on the table, and met their eyes one by one. "Sheriff," the mayor began, his voice strained, "you know why we're here." "I do," Luke replied, his tone calm, resolute. "You want me to hand over the women I claimed days ago, but they're under my protection now, by law." "They are not yours to claim," one rancher snapped. "They were being sold like cattle." "And I ended it," Luke cut in, his voice sharp but steady. "I filed guardianship papers. They are under my protection." The judge's eyes narrowed. "That law was meant for orphans, Callahan, not for Apache women." "They've done nothing wrong," Luke said firmly. "They were taken from open land, accused without proof, tied and put up for sale in front of half the town. If that's justice, then I want no part of it." His words carried through the room, settling heavily in the silence that followed. Nia felt her chest tighten. Her hands trembled, but before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. The room's eyes fell on her, sharp and piercing, but she did not flinch. Her voice rang clear, carrying the weight of truth. "My brother is dead," she said. "He was shot for nothing. We ran to live. We were caught, tied, and dragged here to be sold." She lifted her chin higher, her dark eyes sweeping the men before her. "If you send us away, you send us back to the same men who killed him." Her words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through the crowd. A merchant shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat, unable to meet her gaze. The silence stretched until the mayor exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "You've made your position clear, Sheriff. The council will vote. But it seems you've already decided what you're willing to fight for." "I have," Luke said simply, picking up his hat. The meeting broke in murmurs and shuffling boots. Some men glared openly, others avoided his eyes. But none moved to stop him as he turned and walked back out into the brighter air, the sisters close behind. On the street, the whispers followed, but Nia felt a shift within herself. She had spoken, not hidden, and her words had carried weight. For the first time, she felt the chains of silence break. Luke glanced at her as they reached the sheriff's office. "You spoke," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered. "They had to hear from me, not just you." A flicker of pride touched his eyes before he looked away. "You did well." That evening, Luke brought in a small table he had built himself, setting it near the stove. "For you," he said simply. Nia traced her fingers across the smooth wood, her chest warming. "You built this?" He nodded. "Figured you might want a place to sit that isn't the cot." She swallowed hard, emotion rising like a tide. "We will use it," she said softly. The room began to feel less like a cage and more like a home. Leia sat braiding Nia's hair while Luke worked at the desk, the lamplight wrapping them in golden stillness. Healing wove itself through the smallest gestures, the table, the braid, the quiet comfort of belonging. Later, when night fell and Leia drifted to sleep, Nia stepped out onto the porch. Luke followed, leaning against the post beside her. The stars glittered sharp overhead, the air cool and clean. Their shoulders brushed, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence was not heavy but warm, as if the night itself held them gently. "You remember what you said in there?" Luke asked quietly. "Yes," Nia answered. Her voice was steady now, free of hesitation. "I stay." He nodded once, a rare small smile touching his lips. "Then we'll make sure you can." She turned her gaze to the sky, her heart steady for the first time in months. For so long, she had been running, hiding, fighting to survive. Now, standing beside this man beneath the stars, she felt something stronger than survival. She felt the beginning of a life she could claim, not because it was given, but because together they had fought for it. The town would not rest. Trouble would come again, sharper, harder, more dangerous. But for tonight, the stars burned bright, the porch held its quiet, and Nia leaned into the warmth of Luke's presence with the smallest of smiles. Healing was not a sudden miracle. It was this, standing in the dark with someone who refused to let go. The morning after the meeting carried a strange calm, like the still air before a storm. The frost that had clung to the pump handle was gone, replaced by a soft dust that drifted across Red Bluff's boardwalks. From the porch of the sheriff's office, Luke watched the town with a soldier's eyes, his hat pulled low, his coat hanging heavy with the weight of choices already made. He knew silence in a town like this did not last. Beneath it, whispers sharpened into plans, but he also knew he would not bend. Inside, the office breathed differently. Nia was at the small table he had built, smoothing the folded guardianship papers again and again, as though memorizing the shape of his name at the bottom. Her lips moved quietly as she read what words she could. Leia sat nearby, nibbling a piece of bread, swinging her feet as though testing what it felt like to belong in a place without chains. The stove's warmth touched everything, softening the edges of fear, turning it into something bearable. Healing slipped into their hours like a quiet guest, unnoticed at first, but steady. When Luke came back in, the dust still clinging to his coat, Nia looked up. Their eyes caught, and though she quickly lowered hers, the flicker of trust remained. He hung his hat on the peg, his voice low. "Town's restless. They're talking more today than yesterday." "Talking about us," she said, her tone flat but edged with quiet strength. "Yes," he admitted. "You plan to send us away before they come?" Her question was sharp, but it carried less suspicion now and more a desperate need for certainty. "No," he said simply, his eyes steady on hers. "I plan to keep you right here." Something in her chest loosened at those words, though she turned quickly to the kettle to hide the way her breath caught. She busied herself with pouring water, but inside, a fire steadied, warmer than fear. That afternoon, the sisters stepped outside for the first time without ropes. Nia swept the boardwalk in front of the office, her movements deliberate, her chin high. Leia carried a bucket from the pump, water sloshing at her ankles, but her small smile, quick and shy, caught the attention of a passing merchant who only nodded instead of glaring. Some eyes softened, some stayed hard, but each step in the open was defiance. They were not shadows anymore. Luke watched from the doorway, arms folded, every muscle alert. He saw the way townsfolk looked, some with judgment, some with curiosity, some with something like respect. And he let them see the women not as property, but as people. Let them learn. As dusk fell, the calm cracked. Hooves clattered down the street, a group of riders pulling up before the office. At their center was the judge, his coat fine, his moustache stiff, flanked by deputies. He carried himself like a man who believed the law was his alone to wield. "Evening, Sheriff," he said coolly. "I hear you filed papers. Dangerous precedent, keeping those women." Luke's stance was unyielding. "Dangerous or not, it's legal." "You're putting the town against you," the judge warned, his voice dropping low. "People don't like seeing a lawman claim what they think is theirs." Luke's eyes hardened. "Then people can learn fast what isn't theirs." The deputies shifted uneasily, the tension thick enough to cut. The judge studied Luke for a long, dangerous moment, then gave a sharp nod. "We'll see how long you can hold your ground. There's a town meeting in 2 days. You'll give your answer then." They rode off in a storm of dust, but the weight of their threat lingered. Luke watched them until the last hoofbeat faded, then went back inside. Nia stood near the stove, her hand gripping the rifle, her dark eyes fierce. "They came," she said. "Yes," Luke replied, setting his hat down. "They'll come harder next time." Leia's voice was small from the cot. "Will you give us away?" Luke crouched in front of her, his eyes gentle, though his jaw was set. "No, but it means things will get worse before they get better." Nia crossed the room, her voice steady. "Then we help." Luke looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Help how?" "We do not hide," she answered. "We work, we stand. If the town sees us not as animals but as people, maybe their voices will soften." Luke studied her face, and though he knew some hearts would never change, he nodded slowly. "Then we do it together." That evening, the three of them sat near the stove. Leia leaned against her sister, her head heavy with sleep, while Nia mended the sleeve of her calico dress with neat, quick stitches. Luke wrote at the desk, the scratch of his pen steady against the quiet hum of the fire. It was not peace, not yet, but it was life, and that alone was enough to steady their hearts. Later, when the fire burned low, Luke dozed briefly in his chair. Nia lay awake, her eyes tracing his silhouette in the glow of the coals. His revolver rested within reach, his head tilted slightly forward, the weight of his duty never loosened, even in half-sleep. She thought of the kiss they had shared, of the strength in his arms, of the vow in his eyes, when he said he would not give them up. And for the first time since the canyon where her brother had fallen, she felt something stronger than survival. She felt belonging. She turned onto her side, her fingers brushing the edge of the blanket, and let her gaze linger until sleep claimed her. Healing wrapped around her in the warmth of the fire, in her sister's soft breathing, in the steady presence of the man who refused to let go. Outside, the town braced itself for conflict, whispers sharpening into plans. But inside the sheriff's office, love and defiance had begun to weave themselves together, thread by thread, unbreakable. And as dawn crept closer, Nia's last thought before sleep was not of fear, but of the quiet certainty that no matter what came, they would face it together. The day of reckoning came beneath a sky bruised with grey clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the town as if the heavens themselves weighed in judgment. From the sheriff's porch, Luke watched men gather in the saloon, their voices carrying sharp through the still air. He stood tall, his hand resting near his revolver, not with impatience, but with the calm readiness of a man who had chosen his ground long before the hour arrived. Inside, Nia was braiding her hair with deliberate steadiness, her fingers weaving dark strands into order as though each twist might bind her courage tighter. She had chosen the plain calico dress Luke had bought her, smoothing it carefully across her hips until it felt less like a gift and more like armor. Leia sat on the cot, her bare feet swinging, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. She looked nervous, but not broken. The fear that once bent her shoulders had eased, replaced with a fragile spark of belief. Luke entered, his face set with quiet resolve. "It starts soon," he said. Nia stood, straightening, her chin lifted. "We come too." He hesitated, his protector's instinct fighting with the truth of her words. But when she met his eyes, unwavering, he gave a single nod. "Stay close. Don't let their words cut deeper than they should. You'll walk behind me." The three of them stepped out together, a line unbroken, crossing the street beneath the watchful eyes of Red Bluff. Whispers followed like smoke curling through the air, some sharp, some curious, some softened by something they could not yet name. Nia felt the heat of their stares, but kept her steps steady, each movement a declaration that she was no longer bound, no longer hidden. Leia clutched her sister's hand, her small frame close, her gaze darting, but her chin lifted high. Inside the saloon, the council had gathered. Chairs and benches circled the wide space, the mayor at one end, the judge beside him, ranchers and merchants filling the rest. The air smelled of smoke, whiskey, and tension. When Luke entered with the sisters at his back, the room fell into silence. He removed his hat, set it on the table, and stood square. "Sheriff," the mayor said, his voice carrying strain, "you know why we're here?" "I do," Luke replied. His voice was calm, his presence steady, his eyes scanning every face. "You want me to hand these women over, but they're under my guardianship by law. They're under my protection by choice." "They are not yours to claim," the judge snapped, his tone sharp. "They're a burden, a threat to peace." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Peace does not come from selling women like cattle. Peace comes from standing where no one else will." "They stay." A murmur rolled through the room. One rancher slammed his hand against his knee. "They'll bring trouble on all of us. You can't put this whole town at risk for them." Luke stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floorboards. "The risk came the day they were tied and put on a stage. I won't let Red Bluff carry that stain. Not while I wear this badge." The silence that followed was broken by Nia's voice. Strong, clear, her words cut through the smoke like a blade. "My brother is dead. He was shot for nothing but standing where he had a right to stand. We buried him beneath a cottonwood and ran until we could not run any more. When we were caught, they tied us, dragged us, sold us." She paused, her breath steady despite the fire in her chest. "If you send us away, you send us back to the same hands that killed him." Her words landed heavy, pulling silence over the room. The rancher, who had spoken before, shifted uneasily, unable to meet her eyes. Even the mayor leaned back in his chair, his breath long, his gaze troubled. The judge's lips thinned, his hand curling into a fist, but he did not interrupt. Luke let the silence stretch, then spoke again. "They stay. Anyone who tries to take them will go through me." For a long moment the air was thick with unspoken challenges. Then the mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. "The council will vote, Sheriff. But it seems you've already made your choice." "I have," Luke said simply, retrieving his hat. When the meeting ended, boots scraped across the floor, men muttering as they filed out. Some glared openly, their eyes sharp with warning. Others avoided the sisters entirely, their shame hanging heavy. A few glanced once, then looked away quickly, as though uncertain what to feel. On the boardwalk outside, the air was clearer, brighter. Nia breathed deep, her heart pounding but steady. Luke turned to her. "You spoke," he said.
"Yes," she replied, her voice quiet but certain. "They had to hear me."
His eyes softened, a flicker of pride warming the hardness of his face. "You did well." Back inside the office, the stove's glow welcomed them once more. Luke brought in a small table he had built, its surface smooth, its legs sturdy. "For you," he said simply. Nia touched the wood, her fingers tracing the grain. Something warm blossomed in her chest, fragile but real. "We will use it," she said softly, and for the first time since her capture, the word we felt like home. That evening, Leia laughed again, light, uncertain but true, when Luke fumbled with the kettle and nearly burned his hand. Nia found herself smiling at the sound, a rare bloom in the ash of everything they had lost. Healing spread quietly, carried not by miracles but by bread, by firelight, by the simple rhythm of a man who stayed. When Leia drifted to sleep, Nia stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool, the stars scattered like silver dust. Luke followed, leaning against the post beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. They stood in silence, the weight of the day pressing behind them, but here in the dark it felt lighter. "You remember what you said in there?" Luke asked, his voice low. "Yes," she answered. Her voice was steady, almost defiant. "I stay." A rare, quiet smile touched his mouth. "Then we'll make sure you can." Nia tilted her head back, gazing at the stars. For so long she had lived in shadow, her choices stolen, her freedom crushed. Now, standing beside him, she felt the fragile but unshakable truth. She was no longer surviving. She was beginning to live. The town's anger would not fade. Trouble would come, harder than before. But for this moment, the porch was calm, the stars were bright, and their shoulders touched in a silence that spoke louder than any vow. Healing lived here, in the breath shared beneath the night sky, in the promise carried not by words, but by presence. And when Nia finally turned to look at him, her eyes dark and steady, Luke met her gaze without flinching. For tonight that was enough to bind them to the battles ahead, and to the fragile hope that love, once planted, could weather any storm. The final decision came on a morning painted in soft gold, the kind of dawn that whispered of change before a soul dared to breathe it. The town of Red Bluff stirred early, the creak of wagon wheels, the call of merchants setting their goods, the restless murmur of men gathering for what they thought would be an ending. Luke stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, his hat in one hand, his gaze fixed down the street toward the hall where the council would meet again. He had walked into danger before, but this felt different. This was not just law or duty. This was his heart laid bare before men who would never understand it. Inside, Nia smoothed the calico dress Luke had bought her weeks earlier, her hands steady despite the storm that brewed in her chest. She had tied her hair back, neat and deliberate, as though every strand was an act of defiance. Leia swung her feet nervously from the cot, clutching the edge of the blanket, but even she looked less frightened than before. Their time within these walls had built something stronger than fear. It had built belonging. Luke stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. "It starts soon," he said quietly. Nia rose, lifting her chin. "Then we go together." This time he did not argue. He only nodded once, the faintest hint of pride softening his eyes. The three of them walked down the main street, the townsfolk turning as they passed. The whispers were quieter than before, less venom, more curiosity. People had seen them sweeping the boardwalk, mending clothes, fetching water, ordinary acts of living that had chipped away at walls of hate. Nia felt the weight of their stares, but her steps were steady, her hand resting lightly on Leia's shoulder, guiding her forward. Inside the meeting hall, the council sat in a wide circle, the mayor at the head, the judge beside him, his moustache stiff, his eyes sharp with resentment. When Luke entered, silence fell again, thick and waiting. He removed his hat, placed it on the table, and met their gaze without flinching. The mayor cleared his throat. "Sheriff Callahan, the council has voted." The judge leaned forward, his voice cutting. "This is folly. You've endangered the town." But the mayor raised his hand, silencing him. His eyes met Luke's with something between resignation and respect. "By law, guardianship is yours. As long as you wear that badge, the women remain under your protection." The words struck like a hammer, final and irrevocable. Luke nodded once, steady. Behind him, Nia drew a breath that felt like freedom itself. Leia's small fingers tightened around her sister's hand, her eyes wide with wonder. The judge's face darkened, but he said nothing. The ranchers muttered, their voices sharp but powerless now. The meeting ended not with violence, but with silence, boots scraping as men filed out, defeated by law and the will of one man who would not bend. Outside, the air seemed brighter. The wind carried dust down the street, but for Nia it smelled like the first taste of life after rain. She turned to Luke, her voice soft but certain. "So, we stay." His answer was simple, unshaken. "We stay." Back at the office, Luke laid a final set of papers on the table. Nia picked them up carefully, her eyes tracing the letters, her lips forming the name at the bottom. Callahan. He had given them his name, binding them not as property but as family, as his own. Emotion caught in her throat, and for a moment she could only press her fingers to the ink as though it were a living promise. "You gave us your name," she whispered. "Yes," Luke said, his voice low, steady. "So no one can take you now. Not ever." Something inside her broke free then, not into tears, but into quiet, fierce joy. She nodded once, folding the papers carefully, her hands trembling not with fear, but with hope. That evening, the sheriff's office no longer felt like walls and locks. It felt like a home. The stove glowed warm, bread rested on the table, Leah laughed softly as she braided her sister's hair. Luke sat on the porch, rifle leaning against the post, his eyes scanning the street not with suspicion but with calm. When Nia stepped out to join him, the sky was streaked with orange and pink, the last light of day spilling across their shoulders. "You could have left," she said after a long silence. "You could have started over somewhere else." He looked at her, his eyes carrying the weight of old mistakes and the quiet strength of new choices. "I thought about it, but when I saw you standing on that platform, I knew I was done running too." Her chest tightened, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles. "So, this is where you stay." "This is where I stay," he replied. He reached for her hand, his rough palm closing over hers with a gentleness that steadied her to her core. She let her fingers curl into his, her breath catching at the warmth of the simple touch. Slowly she leaned into him, her shoulder brushing his, her heart steady for the first time in months. When his lips found hers, the kiss was not desperate like the first, nor fierce like the second. It was slow, certain, a promise sealed in the quiet of a settling town. When they drew back, the stars had begun to prick the sky, and Leah's laughter drifted through the window, light and free. Luke slid his arm around Nia's shoulders, holding her there as though the world beyond the porch could rage and he would still stand unbroken. Nia rested against him, her eyes closing for a moment, breathing in the healing stillness of belonging. For the first time since the canyon where her brother had fallen, she believed in tomorrow. Not a tomorrow stolen or feared, but one she could step into with strength, with hope, with love. The night deepened, wrapping Red Bluff in quiet, and as the stars multiplied overhead, the porch of the sheriff's office became more than wood and nails. It became a sanctuary, a beginning, a place where chains had broken and hearts had chosen to stay. If this story touched something in you, if it offered a spark of healing, a reminder that love can rise even in the dust of despair, I invite you to share your heart in the comments. Or let your words join this journey. Let your voice carry the hope forward. And if you wish to walk with us further, to breathe life into more stories of courage and tenderness, then like and subscribe. Together we can keep the fire burning, a light against the dark, a warmth against the cold, a promise that healing and love will always have the last word.